She built the county's most profitable organic farm, with her bare hands, only to be legally evicted by her own husband on their 10th anniversary. Left with $20 and a dusty deed to a barren wasteland, Harper had two choices: walk away forever, or make the dirt bleed green. Harper Sullivan wiped the rich, loamy soil from her brow, leaving a dark smudge across her forehead. It was the afternoon of her 10th wedding anniversary, and she had just finished securing the irrigation lines for the heirloom tomatoes at Suncrest Acres. Over the past decade, Harper had poured her blood, sweat, and youth into transforming a failing 80-acre pasture into a thriving $4 million organic supply hub for high-end restaurants across the state. She knew every inch of the soil, every microorganism that breathed beneath the roots. What she didn't know was the paperwork. When she pushed open the screen door of the farmhouse, expecting to find her husband, Greg Harrison, preparing for their anniversary dinner, she was instead met with a chilling silence. The kitchen table was cleared of its usual rustic charm. In its place sat 3 thick manila folders, Greg and a man in a sharp charcoal suit, whom Harper instantly recognized as David Fletcher, one of the most ruthless corporate attorneys in the valley. "Greg, what's going on?" Harper asked her boots, leaving faint tracks of mud on the hardwood floor she had sanded and stained herself. Greg didn't meet her eyes. He stared at his hands, his jaw tight. It was David Fletcher who spoke, his voice as smooth and cold as polished marble. "Mrs. Harrison, I am here representing Suncrest Holdings, LLC, as well as Mr. Harrison's personal estate. I suggest you sit down." Over the next 20 minutes, Harper's entire reality was surgically dismantled. Greg hadn't just fallen out of love. He had sold her out. Suncrest Acres, the farm she had built from scratch, was never legally hers. When they married 10 years ago, Greg's father had put the original land in a blind trust. While Harper was outside working 14-hour days, digging trenches and building greenhouses, Greg was inside restructuring the LLC. On paper, Harper wasn't an owner or even a co-founder. She was legally classified as an independent contractor. "I don't understand," Harper whispered, the air leaving her lungs. "We are married. This is half mine. I built this. Unfortunately, the prenuptial addendum you signed at 22, the one you thought was a standard liability waiver, stipulates that any agricultural improvements forfeit equity in exchange for a monthly stipend." Fletcher explained, tapping a manicured finger against a signature that looked like hers. "Mr. Harrison is liquidating the property to Apex AgriCorp. The bulldozers arrive on Monday to pave over the northern fields for a commercial logistics center. Your services are no longer required." Harper looked at Greg, searching for a trace of the man she had loved. But the man sitting there was a stranger, hollowed out by greed. And then the final twist of the knife, a sleek silver Mercedes pulled into the driveway. Out stepped Cynthia Wallace, the regional vice president of Apex AgriCorp. She didn't look like a corporate buyer. She looked like a woman who already owned the house. She walked straight in, placing a possessive hand on Greg's shoulder. "Are we almost done here, darling?" Cynthia asked, not even glancing at Harper. The betrayal was absolute. Harper had 30 minutes to pack a single duffel bag. Sheriff Bill Dawson, a man who had eaten Harper's organic sweet corn at the county fair for years, stood by the door, refusing to make eye contact as he supervised her eviction. "I'm sorry, Harper," the sheriff muttered, as she threw her canvas bag into the bed of her beat-up 1998 Ford F-150. "It's a court order. My hands are tied." As she drove away from Suncrest Acres, watching the greenhouses she had built fade in the rearview mirror, a suffocating panic set in. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her credit cards were locked. She had exactly $24 in her wallet. She pulled into a deserted gas station as a torrential downpour began to pound against the windshield. rummaging through the glove box for a napkin to dry her face. Her fingers brushed against a thick, yellowed envelope. It was a deed. A year ago, her eccentric great-uncle Arthur Pendleton had passed away. He had left her 40 acres of land in a forgotten corner of Oakhaven County, a place locals called the Chalk Barrens. At the time, Greg had laughed at the inheritance, calling it a toxic wasteland, not worth the property taxes. Harper had tossed the deed in the glove box and forgotten about it. Now it was literally the only piece of the earth she had left. She turned the key in the ignition, the old Ford sputtering to life. She wasn't driving toward a new beginning. She was driving toward the only place where she couldn't be evicted. Harper arrived in Oakhaven just as the dawn broke, painting the sky in bruised hues of purple and grey. If Suncrest Acres was a green paradise, the Pendleton tract was a lunar nightmare. She parked her truck on the edge of the property and stepped out at the wind, biting through her denim jacket. The 40 acres were completely devoid of life. There were no trees, no weeds, not even a blade of dry grass. The ground was hard-packed, cracked grey clay, glittering menacingly with white chalky residue. Piles of rusted scrap metal, rotting tires, and decaying timber were scattered across the expanse, left behind by decades of illegal dumping. A rusty pickup truck slowed down on the dirt road behind her. An old man with a weathered face and a chewed-up cigar leaned out the window. It was Wallace Becker, a neighbor who ran a small, struggling cattle operation down the road. "You lost, sweetheart?" Wallace rasped, eyeing her out-of-state license plates. "I own this land," Harper replied, her voice hoarse. "I'm Harper Sullivan. Arthur Pendleton was my great-uncle." Wallace let out a sharp, barking laugh. "Arthur was a crazy old coot, and you're just as crazy if you think you can do anything with the barrens. That dirt is cursed. Back in the 70s, there was a chemical runoff from the old textile mill up the river. Soil's so alkaline it'll burn the roots off a dandelion. Better off selling it back to the county for a landfill." He drove off, leaving Harper alone in the dead silence. She walked into the center of the cracked earth, dropped to her knees, and drove a hand trowel into the dirt. The metal screeched against the clay, sparking as it hit a buried rock. The ground was as hard as concrete. For the first time since she left, Greg Harper broke down. She wept into the toxic dust, the weight of her betrayal crushing her. But as the tears hit the dry clay, she noticed something. The water didn't pool and evaporate. It was instantly, hungrily absorbed. The soil was dead, yes, but it was thirsty. Harper was a master soil builder. It was her obsession. She took 5 samples from different corners of the property and drove 3 hours to the State University Agricultural Extension, dumping her last dollars onto the desk of Dr. Leonard Hayes, an aging soil agronomist. 2 days later, Dr. Hayes called her on the lobby payphone of the cheap motel where she had bartered cleaning services for a room. "Harper, this is fascinating," Dr. Hayes said, his voice crackling with excitement. "Wallace Becker is wrong. It wasn't a chemical spill that killed your land. It's an extreme calcium carbonate lockout. The soil is suffocating under its own pH. It's incredibly alkaline, but it's not toxic. It's entirely dormant. If you can break the clay pan and introduce a massive amount of organic acidity, you have a mineral profile beneath that crust that is richer than anything I've seen in this state." She didn't have money for commercial fertilizers or heavy machinery. She had to do it the old, brutal way. Harper drove back to Oakhaven and began her crusade. She visited every local arborist tree trimming service and lumber yard in a 50-mile radius, including Dan's tree service, offering them a free place to dump their wood chips. To them she was a savior, taking their waste. To her, the wood chips were gold. She went to every coffee shop in town, collecting hundreds of pounds of highly acidic, nitrogen-rich, used coffee grounds. For 4 weeks, living in the bed of her truck and surviving on peanut butter and cheap beans, Harper moved mountains. Using only a wheelbarrow and a shovel, she layered the wood chips, the coffee grounds and rotting leaves to build hugelkultur mounds. Massive, spongy, organic raised beds that would slowly decompose, generate heat, and bleed acidity into the alkaline clay, breaking it down. She planted daikon radishes, tillage radishes, whose taproots acted like biological drill bits, driving deep into the concrete-like soil to fracture the hardpan. But her progress had not gone unnoticed. Word reached the valley that Harper Sullivan hadn't vanished. Greg Harrison, sitting in his new corporate office, found out through a mutual acquaintance that Harper was attempting to farm the chalk barrens. Greg's ego couldn't tolerate the idea of her succeeding without him. He wanted her utterly broken. On day 35, a white county vehicle kicked up dust on the road. Code Enforcement Inspector Ronald Davies stepped out, holding a clipboard. Greg had made an anonymous tip. "Miss Sullivan," Inspector Davies said, wrinkling his nose at the smell of decomposing organic matter. "You are running an unpermitted solid waste disposal site. These wood chips and coffee grounds are classified as commercial refuse. You have 7 days to clear this entire property, or the county will fine you $10,000 and seize the land to cover the debt." "This isn't trash, it's compost," Harper yelled, her hands raw and blistered, bleeding through her work gloves. "This is agricultural remediation." "It's a dump," Davies replied coldly, handing her the citation. 7 days, or we lock the gates." Harper sat in the dirt, the citation shaking in her hand. 7 days. It would take a fleet of dump trucks to move the material she had hauled by hand. She was cornered, but as she stared at the deepest trench she had dug for her largest hugelkultur mound, she noticed a strange anomaly. Despite the absolute lack of rain over the past month, the bottom of the 5-foot trench was dark. It was damp. Desperation breeds reckless courage. Harper took the keys to her F-150 and drove to the only man in town who had equipment, Wallace Becker. "Wallace," she said, storming into his barn, "I need your backhoe, right now." "I told you, girl, that land is—" "I don't have money to pay you," she interrupted, slamming her title to her Ford truck on his workbench. "But if I'm wrong, you keep my truck. Give me the backhoe for 2 hours." Wallace looked at the title, then at the wild, blazing determination in Harper's eyes. He grabbed his keys. Under the blistering midday sun, with Wallace watching skeptically from a safe distance, Harper fired up the massive yellow backhoe. She positioned the bucket over the damp trench and drove the steel teeth deep into the earth. She pulled back the lever, ripping up a massive chunk of grey clay. Nothing. She dug deeper. 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet. The machine groaned, the bucket hitting something incredibly hard. Not rock, metal. Harper cut the engine. She jumped down into the deep, dangerous trench armed with a crowbar. Embedded in the bedrock beneath the clay was a heavy, rusted iron cap, locked in place with decades of corrosion. It was an old, forgotten agricultural well had likely capped off nearly a century ago, when the textile mill moved in and the town thought the groundwater was ruined. With a scream of sheer exertion, Harper jammed the crowbar under the lip of the iron cap and threw her entire body weight backward. The rusted bolts snapped. The iron cap flew off. For a split second, there was silence. Then, a terrifying rumble echoed from deep within the earth. "Harper, get out of the hole!" Wallace screamed, running toward the trench. Before she could scramble up the dirt wall, a geyser of water erupted from the pipe with the force of a freight train. It hit Harper square in the chest, blasting her backward into the mud. But as she lay there gasping for air, she didn't taste sulfur. She didn't taste chemicals. She tasted sweet, ice-cold, pure artesian water. It surged upward, flooding the trench, overflowing into the swales she had dug, rushing into the dry, thirsty cracks of the chalk barrens. Wallace stood at the edge of the trench, his jaw unhinged, as the crystal-clear water pooled around Harper's boots. She looked up at the code enforcement citation, lying in the mud, now soaking wet and unreadable. She started to laugh, a wild, triumphant sound that echoed across the desolate valley. The earth wasn't dead. It was just waiting for her. The geyser that erupted from the forgotten well didn't just soak the dry clay of the chalk barrens. It shattered the timeline of Harper's impossible task. For 3 days, the artesian spring flowed unchecked, filling the deep swales Harper had dug and saturating the massive Hugel culture mounds. The dead, cracked earth drank with a desperate thirst. When Dr. Leonard Hayes arrived from the State University later that week, his boots sinking into the newly formed mud, he was practically vibrating with academic excitement. He quickly identified the source, the legendary Oakhaven Basin, a deep underground aquifer that geologists assumed had dried up during the droughts of the 1930s. The old iron cap hadn't been placed there because the water was toxic. It had been capped to build a foundation for a mill that never materialized its existence, buried beneath decades of bureaucratic negligence. "Harper, you haven't just struck water," Dr. Hayes said, holding a vial of the crystal-clear liquid up to the sunlight. "You've tapped into the purest mineral hydration vein in the county. With this water interacting with the acidity of your organic mounds, the chemical reaction will break down the calcium carbonate in the clay 10 times faster than we modeled." But there was still the matter of the $10,000 code enforcement citation and the looming threat of the county seizing the land. Inspector Ronald Davies returned exactly on the 7th day, a smug smirk plastered across his face, fully expecting to lock the gates. Instead, he was met by Dr. Hayes holding a freshly stamped certificate bearing the State University's official seal. "Inspector Davies," Dr. Hayes announced, adjusting his glasses, "this property has been officially designated as an Extension Research Satellite Site for the University Agronomy Department. Ms. Sullivan is conducting state-sanctioned soil remediation trials. Your county waste ordinances do not supersede state agricultural research protections. You can tear up your citation." Davies turned crimson, stammering about municipal jurisdiction, before storming back to his white county truck, defeated. With the legal threat neutralized, the real magic began. The combination of the nitrogen-rich coffee grounds' decaying wood chips and the endless supply of pristine artesian water triggered an explosion of microbiological life. Within a month, the soil began to shift from a pale, sickly gray to a rich, dark brown. Harper planted aggressive cover crops, crimson clover, winter rye, and buckwheat. By month 3, the barren wasteland that locals had mocked for decades was carpeted in a vibrant knee-high sea of emerald green. The taproots of the daikon radishes had successfully fractured the hardpan clay, allowing oxygen to reach deep into the earth. Earthworms, entirely absent just 90 days prior, began to migrate into the rich compost layers. Harper was no longer surviving. She was orchestrating a symphony of rapid ecological restoration. However, miles away at Suncrest Acres, the music had stopped entirely. Greg Harrison was learning a brutal lesson in the realities of farming. Without Harper's obsessive soil management and microscopic attention to detail, the delicate balance of the organic fields had collapsed. Pests decimated the heirloom tomatoes, and a fungal blight tore through the greenhouses. Apex AgriCorp, led by the ruthless Cynthia Wallace, had hit a massive wall. The Municipal Zoning Board had rejected their application to pave over the northern fields for a commercial logistics center, citing environmental impact concerns that Harper herself had covertly flagged through a local wildlife conservation group. Suncrest Holdings, LLC, was bleeding money, and Cynthia was holding Greg personally responsible. Desperate for a lifeline, Greg's corporate attorney, David Fletcher, uncovered a rumor circulating in the local diner about the miracle happening in the Oakhaven tract. A few discreet drone flights over the property confirmed Harper hadn't failed. She was sitting on a massive, highly valuable commercial water source. The greed that had driven Greg to evict his wife flared once again. He didn't just want Suncrest, he wanted the Oakhaven Basin. On a crisp Tuesday morning, a sleek black town car pulled up to the edge of Harper's newly built cedar fencing. Greg stepped out, flanked by David Fletcher. Harper didn't stop fixing the irrigation valve she was working on. She simply wiped her hands on her jeans and stared at the men who had ruined her life just months prior. "You look tired, Harper," Greg said, attempting a patronizing smile. "But I have to admit you've done a nice little landscaping job here." "Get off my land, Greg," Harper replied, her voice steady and ice-cold. Fletcher stepped forward, snapping open a leather briefcase. "I'm afraid it's not exclusively your land, Mrs. Harrison. While you and Mr. Harrison are separated, the divorce is not finalized. Under state marital property laws, any significant asset appreciation discovered during the legal marriage, such as a multi-million-dollar aquifer, is subject to equal division. We are filing an injunction to halt your operations and force a sale of the water rights." Greg crossed his arms, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You thought you could just walk away and strike it rich while Suncrest struggles." "You're still my wife on paper, Harper. Half of this water belongs to me." Harper stared at the legal documents in Fletcher's hands. The panic that had seized her 6 months ago threatened to return a cold shadow creeping over the green paradise she had built with her bare hands. They were trying to evict her a second time. Harper didn't weep this time. She didn't bargain. She took the injunction papers, drove straight to the city, and walked into the chaotic, paper-stacked office of Mitchell Davis, a grizzled, no-nonsense litigation attorney known for taking cases that pissed off corporate firms. Mitchell read through the original Suncrest eviction papers, the prenup, and the new injunction, pushing a half-empty mug of black coffee across his desk. For a long time he said nothing. Then a slow, predatory smile spread across his weathered face. "Fletcher is a shark," Mitchell said, leaning back in his squeaky leather chair. "But he's a sloppy one. When they drafted that addendum 10 years ago to screw you out of Suncrest, they used an absolute boilerplate shield clause to protect Greg's trust fund. They made the wall completely impenetrable." "Meaning what?" Harper asked, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Meaning?" Mitchell chuckled, tapping a thick finger against a specific paragraph. Section 4, Clause B. It states that any and all assets, properties, or inheritances acquired by either party independently, and all subsequent yields, discoveries, or appreciations of said assets remain strictly, entirely, and irrevocably the sole property of the inheriting individual, completely immune from marital community property claims. Mitchell looked up, his eyes flashing. Greg designed this trap to ensure you could never touch his father's farm, no matter how much value you added to it, but he locked the door from the inside. By his own ironclad legal design, he cannot touch a single drop of water, nor a single blade of grass, on your great-uncle's land. He legally castrated his own claim. The courtroom showdown 2 weeks later was a bloodbath, brief and brutal. Judge Caroline Weaver, a stern woman with zero tolerance for corporate bullying, reviewed the documents. "Mr. Fletcher, Judge Weaver," said, her voice echoing in the silent courtroom, "you cannot rely on a contract to disinherit your wife from one property and then attempt to ignore that exact same contract when she discovers value in another. The injunction is denied. Furthermore, I am finalizing the divorce decree today with prejudice against the plaintiff. Mr. Harrison, you have zero claim to the Oakhaven property. Case dismissed. Greg stood frozen at the plaintiff's table, his face draining of color. Harper walked past him, without a single glance, her boots echoing against the marble floors, sounding like a steady, unstoppable drumbeat. 6 months later, the property formerly known as the Chalk Barrens was officially registered as Oakhaven Springs, and it was nothing short of a breathtaking agricultural miracle. The once toxic clay had been completely transformed into deep, friable black topsoil. Rows of high-yield specialized crops stretched across the 40 acres. Harper had bypassed standard vegetables entirely. She cultivated rare culinary lavender high-grade saffron crocus and cultivated specialized oyster mushrooms in the shaded areas beneath the newly erected processing barns. Because of the pure mineral content of the artesian water, local executive chefs claimed her produce possessed a flavor profile unmatched anywhere in the state. Wallace Becker, the old cattle rancher who had loaned her the backhoe, had sold his struggling herd and now worked as Harper's foreman, driving a brand-new electric utility vehicle across the lush fields. The farm was operating at a stunning 60% profit margin, completely debt-free. But the ultimate harvest was yet to come. On a bright Tuesday afternoon, Harper sat on the porch of her newly built, modest timber frame cabin, sipping coffee. Mitchell Davis had called her with the final update. Suncrest Holdings, LLC, had completely collapsed. Without the zoning approval, Cynthia Wallace and Apex AgriCorp had abandoned the project, suing Greg for breach of contract regarding the land's usability. Buried under insurmountable legal fees and failing crop yields, Greg had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The bank had foreclosed on Suncrest Acres. The original 80-acre farm, the place where Harper had spent 10 years of her life, was being sold at a public bank auction to recoup the debts. Harper drove to the county courthouse steps the following morning. Greg was there, looking disheveled hollow and 10 years older, standing by helplessly as the auctioneer rattled off numbers. When the bidding opened, the corporate buyers hesitated, knowing the soil at Suncrest was currently compromised by blight and mismanagement. Harper raised her paddle. She bought back Suncrest Acres for literally pennies on the dollar, paying for it entirely in cash generated from the first massive harvest at Oakhaven Springs. As the gavel slammed down, securing her ownership, Greg finally locked eyes with her. There was no anger left in him, only the crushing realization of his own ruin. He had traded gold for dirt, and she had turned dirt into an empire. Harper didn't gloat. She didn't say a word to him. She simply took her stamped deed, walked out into the bright sunlight, and got back into her truck. She had 2 farms to run soil to heal, and an endless spring of water to share with the earth. The girl who had been kicked out with $20 in her pocket had returned to buy the kingdom. If Harper's incredible journey of resilience, sweet revenge, and turning barren dirt into a multi-million-dollar farming empire inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button to support hard work over corporate greed. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that hitting rock bottom is just the beginning of a comeback. And make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing real-life stories of triumph and justice.